All right, welcome back to Journey's Binge the Bible podcast. Today is episode 4, and I'm joined with some awesome people. We've got Rachel and Barron and Blake, and of course, our lead pastor, Scotty, who yesterday walked us through the book of Numbers. And Scotty, how you feeling, man? You had Leviticus last week, and then you had Numbers yesterday. How you doing?
Yeah, man, that's a heavy lift. That's a heavy lift. I know Deuteronomy's coming, but yeah, I don't know exactly how I got in that order because Genesis, man, a lot of story, a lot of Exodus. I mean, they made a movie about it. I mean, but yeah, Leviticus and Numbers. But hopefully it was helpful.
You gotta talk to whoever does the preaching calendar.
Yeah, I know. You would think somebody would be in charge. Yeah. No, it was good. It was good. I think a lot of our people walked away with, oh, I'm connecting some dots. I'm seeing how these things fit with New Testament themes. Oh, I have skipped over a lot of those passages and books before because I didn't. So I'm glad we got to dive into it.
Yeah. And, obviously in this series, we're taking 30, 35 minutes to cover an entire book every single week. And I thought you did an excellent job yesterday, by the way, kind of giving a 10,000 foot view of the theme of Numbers and the purpose of it. But is there anything in particular that you couldn't really dive into yesterday that you saw in studying this week or last few weeks that maybe you want to kind of pull out a little bit more of?
Well, I mean, there's several instances in the book of Numbers where the people rebel and God punishes them. Um, 3 or 4. And that's a really heavy topic to get into. There are obviously reasons. There's reasons around the severity of sin. There's doubt and unbelief. There is the capacity for those people's sin to derail an entire nation. I mean, there's chaos and calamity when those kinds of things happen. So God acts swiftly. And so, yeah, I mean, those were some things that we really didn't get to dive into, but that's its whole topic about how God punishes sin, how God deals with our rebellion, and it is severe because of the consequences of it. I mean, there's stories of the earth swallowing people up. There's plague. There's vipers. So we might be able to dive into some of that now, but yeah, you that in 27 minutes in a message that we also talked about Christmas store didn't get to squeeze a lot of that in.
Well, there's one instance in particular with Moses when he strikes a rock because he's so angry, and some people have heard of that, some people haven't, obviously. But why was that such a big deal?
Well, I have my thoughts, but we have Blake and Barron and Rachel on here. Would you guys want to jump in on that so that I make sure I'm not wrong on my thoughts so I can hear from experts?
Well, I don't
Blake,
want to be
take it.
first because, yeah, you said my name. I don't want to be first because I'm definitely not the expert. But just if you don't know the story, the gist is that God tells him to speak to the rock, and then he hits the rock. So at its basic level, he disobeyed God. He didn't do what God said. And there's a bigger theme that we see throughout Scripture where here Moses of all people had seen the power of God when he stood before Pharaoh and God demonstrated these amazing miracles when he has his first encounter with God and the bush is burning but it doesn't burn up. He sees the presence of God. I mean, time after time. Of course, the Red Sea, so many times that when I say the Red Sea, I mean they parted the Red Sea and they went through on dry ground. So if you don't know those stories, there's these miraculous things that God moves the earth itself, the elements itself, and then he gets to this place where he tells him very specifically, speak to the rock, but he doesn't speak. He hits the rock, and then he has this little statement after that where he says that that he kind of yells at the people a little bit, maybe at least that's how I envision it, and he says that we're going to bring this water. and he uses the word we, like me and Aaron are doing
Hmm.
this. It's a nuance, but I think it's important because how often that heck, we can do it ourselves as pastors, as leaders in ministry, where we
Hmm.
forget sometimes. I mean, we know it intellectually, we know it in our heart, but we forget, and we
Hmm.
think because of past successes that God has given us, that God is going to give us future successes, and somehow we think, oh, it's I'm doing this. And I really think
Hmm.
that's, for me, that's kind of the mistake he made, is he forgot who was the miracle worker. It wasn't him, it was God.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, if I can weigh in, I think, one of the big things also that I was thinking about yesterday was that, essentially he's misrepresenting God, because God in this moment is trying to show mercy to these people, trying to give them water, and Moses' frustration boils out. And as a human being, we go, yeah, I get it that Moses was frustrated. These Israelites are idiots, they just don't listen, they rebel, they do all these things. But as a leader, Moses is supposed to reflect God's heart and not his own emotions. And so, in that moment, he makes this misstep. And, the thing with like the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. That's true. But with great responsibility also comes great accountability. And so, Moses is supposed to be this example to people, because remember, God's trying to teach them how to be a people that follow him. And then Moses, the leader, who's supposed to be the one who is experiencing God face to face, who's the go-between between God and the people, does exactly what he's not supposed to do, what God is trying to teach the Israelites not to do, and not to rebel and not to be disobedient. And I think it's just this kind of moment of a leadership fail, just which is so easy to do. As leaders, every day we make mistakes. We say things we shouldn't say, or react in conversations in a way that we think, I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have reacted that way. So I can relate to Moses because sometimes people are frustrating.
What?
It
Never.
happens. Something's
Like
going
I
on in my
mentioned,
camera.
I mentioned. Oh, Jason.
I think it really illustrates just the destructive consequences of anger, right? The Bible says a lot about anger, and it often talks about anger in terms of fools. And so you just think of how, one moment of frustration and anger can change the trajectory of your life or people around you. This one time when Moses got so angry, he disobeyed God, it literally changed his future. And so I'm sure we'll get into that story a little more, but it just makes me think, I think about myself, I think of my family, I think of how I parent, I think of how
Mm.
I lead, I think of my influence. And it's so important not to, just misspeak in anger, not to let anger carry you away, carry you off God's path for what He has for you. And I just think it's kind of a sad example, but at the
Hmm.
same time, it's a lesson for us to learn.
Yeah, that's so good. I haven't thought about it like that. That the anger of the moment like kept him from the promised land. That God had, but God had been merciful. Sometimes when you're listening to that or hearing that, like, that's so sad that one thing. But I mean, Moses, his story kind of starts out with him murdering somebody. So God has been pretty gracious to Moses all along the way, and his own personal failures, and I probably, hey, we get all the way to the end of that, and then this anger and frustration. Great lesson for parents. The words we say to our kids and the marks. I can remember things that my parents or other people said to me in moments of frustration and anger that just get tattooed on your soul, and
Yeah.
think about what that meant for all those people. So yeah, good
Yeah.
stuff.
Woo. So here's a fun question. How do we lead in the midst of lead well and faithfully in the midst of people grumbling, in the midst of people complaining, in the midst of this or that or the other? How do we stay faithful as leaders?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned yesterday, church people don't do that anymore. So it's hard for me to relate. It's hard for me to relate with grumbling and complaining. My kids never did that either. So um, I'm trying. If any of you guys have experience with that, it would be good for you to jump in because I have a hard time relating with complaining from God's people. I'm just kidding. No, yeah. It's really fun that yesterday when I got off the stage, walked out in the atrium, shake hands, talk to people, pray for people. I had several complaints, and I thought how ironic that you're they weren't even connecting the dots of, hey, I got a little feedback for you, and they missed the whole complaining thing. So yeah, fun. Somebody jump in on that. Help me get out of this hole.
Yeah, maybe
Baron,
it's
I've
just.
actually got a. Oh, go ahead, Blake.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, JT.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I've got a question for Baron. Because Baron, I think about your family's story, right? You grew up in South Africa. God saves you. God rescues you, heals you, calls you to something different, and you've had a battle, man, going from one continent to another, and that is mind blowing in its own right. But I know along the way there's been a lot of great stuff, but there's also been a lot of really hard things. So if you have any just wisdom for people, like how do you stay faithful in the midst of that? Because God's promised X, Y, and Z, although we all have different expectations of what that might look like. But in the midst of the struggle for you guys, how have you kept your focus on the right thing, and how have you remained faithful as a husband, as a father, as a leader of people?
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, and continues to be a wild ride. I think um, there's a bunch of different factors at play. I think we still haven't come to the end of or the conclusion of this thing, so we're still in like the wilderness, right? Like we experienced the promise of God. We're coming to this country. We want to be in this country. We feel like this is what God has planned for us. And the goal is to eventually, become citizens and be able to stay here and raise our family here. But right now we're in that middle piece. We're in the wilderness,
Mm,
where we kind of see the promise. We're hoping for the promise. We're praying for the promise, but we're still not there yet, And so I guess, what's helpful for us as a family is reminding ourselves of how faithful God has been in the past. And just, oftentimes coming back to those conversations of going, if he's been faithful, he will be faithful.
mm,
Um, and at the same time, trying to bring our kids into this thing, in this conversation, like we're oftentimes at the dinner table, we'll talk about what we're praying for and talk about what's going on in our lives, and we try to eat dinner together every single night to have that family time. Um, and we try to bring our kids into how this is shaping their faith.
mm,
Like mom and dad are, because this visa talk and green card talk is always on our lips, and people are always asking
mhm,
us at church because they care and they want to know what's going on, and kids hear that, and so we've learned you can't isolate your kids from the difficult things in life. You have to bring them along and go, look, this is difficult, and there's no denying that, but how do we navigate this as followers of Christ, knowing that at the end of the day, whether we stay or whether we go, God is still good,
mhm,
um, and that he still has a plan and he's still in control, and that we might pray tonight or pray today, and we might not get an answer tomorrow, but God works on a different timeline than we work on. And so we try to encourage each other like that. And then just to be honest with you, like there's hard days and then there's good days.
mm,
And it's kind of like this up and down, and fortunately when I'm down, my wife is usually up, and she's like
mm,
chipper and has courage and, is full of faith. And then when she's down, then I'm like, it's going to be okay. We got to trust God. So fortunately, we're not
mm.
both down at the same time, because I don't know what we
Yeah,
do. We'd have to do something. I don't know. But yeah, so we're learning to trust in the wilderness, and learning that God's silence is not absence. It just means that he's busy working behind the scenes doing something. And that's what we're trusting for. And so yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, man.
it's good, man.
It's it's so tough because none of us want to be in the wilderness, and
Yeah.
um, and Scotty, obviously you talked a lot about that yesterday, just the fact that in the wilderness is where God shapes us and he develops us, he grows us. And we're, let's be honest, in America, we're very comfortable. Everything's accessible. We can get anything at our house in 2 hours. And, it's hard to experience hardship. And so, Baron, just thank you for being honest about, hey, sometimes it's really good and other times it's really hard. And I think it's okay to be honest about that. Scotty, one of the things that you did spend some time on yesterday was specifically the 12 spies. And one of the things you talked about was 2 filters. You want to dive a little bit deeper into that, and what I mean by that is, why is that so important? And, what can we learn now from the right perspective or the right filter or lens to look through?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the filters of fear and faith, and that the 10 had a filter of fear. They were seeing obstacles, but Joshua and Caleb were seeing opportunities. They were seeing giants. Joshua and Caleb were seeing God at work. And here's the reality, though, just as a person, is like I switch back and forth between those 2 filters sometimes in the same 15 minutes. That it's always a tug between those 2 things. Of that is the battle of faith, right? Suppressing fear, magnifying God's power, reminding ourselves, just like Baron said, of God's faithfulness in the past, his power in the present. So it's super easy to look at that group of people and go, why didn't you have faith? But the number of times on a weekly basis when I let fear grab hold, the uncertainty, the anxiety that just cripples me, and I'll go for days sometimes in that mindset or filter, and then a little glimmer of hope in that. But it's in those moments that you press up. I don't think Joshua and Caleb were saying this is going to be easy. They saw the same things. And in fact, fast forward, Joshua leads them there. They have to conquer 32 nations. They didn't just walk in and everybody's like, "Oh, Israel's here. Let's give them they had to fight battles, but they knew God would be with them." Rachel, what would you say, like in that? What was your takeaway?
Yeah, I think my takeaway, I wrote it down, but the wilderness, and as it relates to these 2 filters, I really think it can either destroy us or it can shape us into who God's creating us to be. You think of those 10 spies, 8 of them, you never hear about them again. They died in the wilderness like so many others did. But like Joshua and Caleb, they had to deal with what happened because of the disobedience of not going in and taking the land, but yet God used that time to shape them into who he was creating them to be, which, as we know, maybe not everybody knows, us in this circle know, but for others out there, Joshua was the successor to Moses. He was an incredible leader. And so I think it's just so interesting, those 2 different lenses that you can look through as you're walking through hard things, as you're walking through the wilderness. Are you going to let fear and doubt take you down, or are you going to grab hold of it, say, you know what, God's shaping me into the person that he's created me to be, and these hardships, though they're hard, they're building character and they're giving me experiences that I need for the next thing. There's always a next thing that God has for us.
Blake, what do you think, man? You've got a lot of experience, family, grandkids.
Just about this 10 and 2 and the filters. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
The filter thing. Yep.
Yeah, I just think it's good. I can't think of that story without thinking of Caleb, this guy who's 85 years old, and he's faithful to God, and he gets to be with Joshua, and make it into the promised land because he believed God. At the end of the day, it was faith. What separated the 2 from the 10? It was their faith. And Scotty, you said it yesterday. It was their belief that they're, as Scotty said so well. They're seeing the same things, but they had faith to believe that God is bigger than the quote unquote giants that they're seeing. That God, they were doing what we so often forget to do, is that they were looking back to the past of God's past faithfulness and believing that, well, God's done it up to this point. Why shouldn't I believe that he's going to do it tomorrow as well? And like you said, Scotty, I'm the same way. I mean, in the same 15 minutes, I can forget that. On one hand, I have faith. On one hand, I give in to fear, anxiety, or doubt. Often it's doubt. It's not that I don't think that God has the ability to do it. It's just that I wonder if he'll do it for me in this circumstance, And so anyway, I just think it's a great story of faith, and I love Caleb, especially for any people who are a little further along in their life. And here's this guy, 85 years old, man. He's not just a man of great faith. He engages in battle. He kicks some serious tail. I mean, that guy's awesome. I love that Caleb story.
Well, I think there's also, I think we can be honest, and Scotty, you mentioned this, that we, looking back a few thousand years later, we're armchair quarterback, and we're like, guys, really, where was your faith? God's done all these things. They were looking at giants. If I saw a 12-foot man, I'd be a little freaked out too. I think we can be honest about that. But it is important in the midst of that fear to remain faithful. And again, as Baron, you mentioned this earlier too, for your story and your journey, hey, God's been faithful in so many areas. And that's one of the beautiful things about us being able to now navigate the Old Testament. They were living it out. They were pioneering. They were learning as they went. We get to look back and learn and glean wisdom and lessons of incredible failure, but also incredible faith.
Yeah.
And
I think, Scotty, you said something yesterday. You said, how 10 people or 10 men were influencing the entire destiny and direction of the lives of millions of people, and I from a practical standpoint, I can't help but just think about like how important leadership is, well, first of all, like, just because someone has a platform doesn't mean you need to follow them, right? Like these guys, they were prominent. They had the platform, so to speak, but they didn't have the vision. And so, for us in the world we live in today, with all of this, like, social media and everything we get bombarded with, just because someone has a platform doesn't make them worth following. And I think sometimes we've got to be careful who we listen to, especially when it's about like what the direction is and where we want our lives and our families' lives to go. We need to ask ourselves like who are these people that we're listening to? Who are these people that we're following? And I think about like leaders. The leaders are the ones that are not necessarily the loudest or the the most extravagant or all these kinds of things. Leaders are the ones that look at something and see what other people can't see, and see what could be instead of what is not. And I think about like the journey that our church has been on over the last 18 years. I think you said on Sunday you've been leading the church for 18 years. There was a stage when we were meeting in that grocery store, like you say, the ugliest grocery store in the world. And then you stood over that piece of property at Castle Pines and looked at that and said, well, look at what could be, and you trusted God for that. And I think, that's just a testament to really good leadership, going, hey, some people see a piece of dirt that is next to a highway that is impossible to find and is in the middle of a neighborhood, but you saw the potential to build a church. And because of that, we're all here today, So I think, I just realized again that leadership is so, so important. How we lead our families, how we lead ourselves, how we lead the people at work, and how we decide to see what can be instead of what is right now,
Yeah, just the power of words, right? We talked about that a little bit of like leadership and listening to the right voices and the power of words. I think it was last Friday. I was at lunch with uh, a gentleman named Jerry Summer, and Jerry was the chairman of the board at Journey for probably a decade. He was 15 years older than me, and just speaking about that piece of property, I would love to say, oh man, I was such a man of faith and I saw it. And I said, he lifted the torch. But guess who was standing beside me in that moment? Jerry Summer, older, wiser man, saying into my ear, we should buy this today. And just the words of confidence of, I believe we're supposed to do this, but man, I'm afraid, or just the words of, this is good. Let's move. Like, if those voices, we would not be probably, I know we wouldn't be where we are as a church today without the right voices surrounding us saying, we think this is good. We think this is God. And so, yeah, I think listening. It's also really an interesting fact that every time the people of God in the Bible vote, the majority, they're wrong every time. So be careful when the mob is going that way.
Yeah.
Be careful when all of the winds of culture, all of the voices are saying this is wrong. Listen for, because it's normally the voice of God saying, there's a different way. It's hard and it's uncomfortable, but come follow me. What
Yeah.
Jesus said, hey, the road is wide that leads to destruction, but it's narrow that leads to life. So,
I hear you talking about a generation above you when you just shared that story, right?
yeah,
That the next generation above you is standing with you, wanting to take this ground, if you will. And one of the big themes of Numbers is basically in the book of Numbers, it contrasts the unbelief of one generation, but with the faith of the next. And so I'm trying to imagine being Moses in that situation where I've done all these things. God's allowed me to do all these things, but I can't go to that next step. I don't get to go to the promised land, but I'm going to do everything I can to train up that next generation. Why does that matter in today's context more than ever? Blake, take a shot at that one, man.
Well, yeah, because the next generation is the future. Because I got 7 awesome grandkids, and I want to see the world that they live in, thrive. And Scotty, Marcy and I were saying at dinner last night, I was so grateful that you, in your message yesterday, you just acknowledged what God is doing in this moment in history of people reading the Bible and going to church, and God's Spirit is moving in people. And a lot of that is happening in the lives of this next generation of younger adults. And it's just so encouraging that God's going to do, what God wants to do. And, Justin, when you're talking about that generation died in the wilderness, and then the next generation went in, Scotty mentioned that yesterday. I was thinking about that, and you mentioned, Scotty, if y'all listening don't know the story, but, imagine Moses had relied on his sister and his brother, on some leaders, and then they start to complain. They start to turn on him, and they stir up all these people who are going to turn on him. And it was because of those 10 that doubted and these that rebelled that they ultimately can't go in, that generation has to die in the wilderness. And I was thinking about it in relating to people that we know that don't know the Lord. That some people sometimes say this about God. This is kind of their hang up with God. They're like, I don't know about a God who hurls people into hell, throws people into hell. Well, if you read the Bible, you realize actually God doesn't send anybody into eternal separation. He just simply says, oh, that's what you want? I'll let you have what you want. And that's kind of what happened. And we learned this story back in Numbers because these people basically said, I want to go back to Egypt. It'd be better if we were to die in Egypt or even die in the wilderness than to go to this promised land. And God's like,
okay,
well, okay. If that's what you want, we'll just do that. I mean, when you get to the life and teachings of Jesus, I mean, that prodigal son story in Luke 15, that younger son says, I'm going to go to a distant country. And what's the father do? Okay. He lets him go, I may get it wrong, maybe you can get it right, but maybe it's later in Matthew 23 or something, where Jesus says this phrase he says, for how long I've wanted to gather you, like a mother gathers her children or a hen gathers her chicks, but you were unwilling. You were unwilling. And this, God doesn't force himself on us. And it goes all the way back to Garden of Eden, that he gives us freedom. We all want freedom. And he says, okay, but with this freedom comes great responsibility to make the right choice. And back to your question, Justin, that generation, they didn't make the right choice. And so with every new generation, there's a new opportunity to make the right choice. And we're seeing it happen in our own church. We're seeing it happen in kids ministry. We're seeing it happen in youth ministry, young adult ministry. People are choosing to follow the Lord, and it's super encouraging.
Yeah. Let me, like, one other thought, like, to jump in. Blake and I are in this stage, or entering, we're young in this stage, but we have adult kids and grandkids. And there's part of you that, like, feels all this empathy for Moses. You did all this and you don't get to go to the promised land. But he comes right up to the edge and he gets to see his children and grandchildren. And, like, he gets to see Joshua, the man that he has poured so much into. You know, he basically lays his hands on him. And there's a shift if you grow and mature in Jesus into this legacy moment where you're just as excited for the people that you've helped follow Jesus, that young adults, your kids, they can come stand on your shoulders and, like, yeah, I might not ever see that, but there's something that happens that you're just as excited for them as you are for yourself. You go from young man, young woman, young leader, I've got to conquer the mountain, to I got to help somebody else get up the mountain. And there's a shift in that. And, like, yesterday, it didn't go out to all the locations because I said it after the sermon was over, but we did child dedication earlier in the service, babies. My grandchild was dedicated in the service. And then as we are leaving the service, I look over and Aislinn Bragg is leading worship. She's a senior in high school. She came to Journey when she was the age of my granddaughter. So, 18 years of, her being involved in our church. I was so proud of her. I was so excited for her what a moment of dedication and young adults leading us in worship. So I think there's something going on there too, where there's a sadness about not entering the promised land, but there's also a lot I just make up, there's a lot of excitement, pride, for Moses to go, I've led these people faithfully, and now they will go and do what I cannot do. And I think there's a whole generation of young adults, teenagers, kids that are being held in the nursery who will lead Journey into this next decades. Our church and the churches where they go and live. So
one of the things I've seen in my life is, as far as leadership, that I respect so much. The most faithful leaders I've ever seen, or maybe the most impactful I've ever been around, are those that truly are selfless and genuinely want to serve, versus just trying to get their piece of the pie, or just their ego being stretched, or that platform. But the ones that shift into, I'm going to be selfless and I'm going to just pour out to the people around me who God's put right in front of me. There's something powerful in that. And I'm constantly needing to be reminded of serving others first versus serving myself. And especially in thinking about the next generation. Rachel, how do you and Ron just pour into your kids? I mean, we're in a place where entertainment is king. How are you coaching them on reading the Bible and getting into understanding who God is? What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's tough because there's a balance, because you don't want to try to force them to, but you want to cultivate an interest in them so that they want to, and so I feel like that's a little bit of a tension. But for us, I think the biggest thing is just modeling to our children. The biggest parenting win that I've ever had is, having my quiet time in the morning and my son grabbing his devotional and coming and sitting next to me, curling up next to me and opening up his devotional. You know what I mean? Because he sees me doing that. He sees Ron, my husband, doing that. And so he wants to model that. Children naturally do that, and he's younger. He's 6 years old, and he's, been doing that since he was probably 3, which is awesome. But my girls are 12 and they're 9. So they're getting a little older. My oldest just started middle school. Technology is a thing. As you said, they go to an iPad school. So they always have iPads. And so it's always scary. Like, what are they seeing that I can't control? what, boundaries am I putting in place that they're going to find a way around? And so those things are always in our mind, but always trying to just teach them what's right and build up that strong foundation. When we bring them up in church, when we bring them up reading the Word of God, as Baron was saying, sitting around the table, as a family talking about God or what's going on in our lives or how God's showing up, that's creating a foundation in them. And we talk about leadership. We talk about what it means to speak life and to speak truth and what's right and what's wrong. And so the hope is that they have a strong enough foundation that when they're faced with things that, you know, culture is throwing out at them, they're strong enough to say, hey, I know that's not really what's right. I know that's not something I should be listening to. I know that that's not something I should be watching, and they're going to make mistakes just like we do, but also being there to kind of coach them through it. We are raising up the next generation. We have to have a lot of grace, I think, and I'm still navigating that myself. So I can probably take some lessons from several of you guys.
Yeah. So one other fun question that it sounds great in theory, but one of the themes of Numbers is what does it look like to practically follow the cloud? Like, how, I mean, we understand there's clouds in the sky, but what does that, like, when you get down to it, what does that mean? Baron, what are your thoughts on that, man?
Well, I think, God, I think God speaks in so many different ways every single day. And the what we just need to do as his people is make time to listen and to try to listen, and to go like, what is God saying to me? Where is he leading me? Where is he leading my family? And where is he leading me as an individual? I'm trying to discern, what is the will of God for my life? I wish it was as simple as a literal cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night, because I've often found myself in this kind of situation where I feel like I'm trying to listen to what God is saying, I'm trying to follow his leading, but I'm not really hearing this. I'm not hearing an audible voice. I'm not hearing like a, hey, pick option B and everything will be okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I've kind of learned that is part of the process, right? Is that I don't think that God necessarily has only one specific thing that he wants us to do. Like, there's not option A, B, or C, and only option B is the right one. I think through the grace of God and through the omnipotence of God, we find ourselves wandering and making mistakes and taking 2 steps this way and 3 steps that way and getting back on track. And somehow God is able to still orchestrate and still help us reach the destination or the direction that he wants us to go in, because there's been times in my life when I've felt like, oh, I missed God on this, and maybe I did, and then through his grace, he's taken that situation and turned it into something, better, and something that it eventually either teaches me something about him, teaches me something about myself, or guides me to where he wanted me to be, and so
Mm-hmm.
I think the mistake people make the whole often is trying to wait for a sign, and they get into this like this constant limbo of, God is going to appear to me in a burning bush, and then I'm going to act, then I'm going to start serving, then I'm going to start uh, taking my wife on dates, then I'm going to start doing this. And, those things don't happen. God has already given us so much wisdom and so much direction in his word already. Why,
Mm-hmm.
why does he need to send a message in the sky saying, hey, Justin or Barry, you need to go and do this, Um, but I think, the wisdom, you find wisdom in the counsel of many. I've found it very helpful in my life when I'm trying to discern big decisions and trying to make choices that could have very long-term effects, is seeking out wise counsel, people who I know follow God and believe in him and trust him and have experience and are older than me. People who are much older than me, like Scotty and Blake,
Yeah,
those
yeah,
kinds of
yeah.
people.
Thanks.
Um, I rely on their wisdom to speak into those situations, and go like, what do you think? What do you think God is trying to say, and how's he trying to direct me in my life?
I think
That's
that's
I would
good.
say I would say
good,
that
Blake.
I agree with you, Baron, 100%. God speaks in a multitude of ways, and I like how you said that a lot of what God is saying to us, He's already said in His Word. I think
Yeah.
that's really wise and well said. And Scotty, just yesterday when you were talking about those statistics we referenced earlier about
Hmm.
the number of paper Bibles that have been sold and the number of downloads of the U version, I think we said it in I should know, I said it in the first Genesis one, but I think we said something like, we all have this hunger for God. And what I found is that it's most satisfied in the Bible. So I would
Right.
just say that the way you follow the cloud, the majority of the way you follow the cloud is in the Bible. I would say
Hmm.
the majority. I don't know the percentage, but a lot of what God has to say is in the Bible. And then what Barron said, I agree. Like to have trusted Christian friends, solid Christian people, and through messages and sermons and podcasts that God is, that are founded in God's word. God can speak to you that way. And then there's this other way that God leads me through the cloud, and that's by His Spirit. And that's, I think we would all agree, that's the most difficult, often way to discern. Like, is this what God is saying? Is that what God is saying? And I always go back to God's word to check it first. What does God's word say? And then run it by trusted Christian friends. And then at some point, we mentioned this earlier, it's a step of faith. It's to say, I think this is what God's saying, and I'm going to step out in this direction, Lord,
Hmm.
with the belief that this is what you're leading me to. And it's not a perfect science. And if you're listening to this, to ministry leaders, we just confess that we get it. It's not always easy to exactly hear what God is saying, but there is a lot of things that God has already said that we can take confidence in. Sorry, Scott, I
Hmm.
interrupted you earlier.
No, it's great. I'll just, maybe land the plane today with this, like right there, little chair, call it the prayer chair. Almost every day of my life, I end up sitting there early in the morning, reading the Bible. And as we've all mentioned, God has already spoken. There are some things, it is always God's will. If I'm trying to find the cloud in the presence of God, like it just becomes that foundation and anchor. When I'm looking, I pray sitting in that chair every morning, God, let me see you at work. Let me join you in that work. It's always God's will for me to be kind. It's always God's will for me to seek out people who are far from Him to help them find their way home. There's certain things that it's like God doesn't need to say it again. He's already said it. And then when I get up out of that chair and leave and go through the day, if you've started your day like that, going, God, I'm looking for you today, you're more likely to see him. Have you ever bought a new car or looking for a new car, and then you go, oh, this feels like a unique car. And then you're driving down the road and you go, this car is everywhere. I see this car. Why? Because I was looking for it. You see ads scrolling by. If you don't need a refrigerator, you don't even notice them. But when you need a refrigerator, like I did last week, I'm looking at fruit because my mind's on it. And I think if we wake up going, I want to see God at work, I want to see the cloud moving, somehow God opens that up and reveals it to us if we're intentional. So, good way to start today and good way to stop this podcast, Justin. Let's look for the cloud.
Well, guys, thank you for joining us. Journey will be back with you next week as we cover Deuteronomy episode 5. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.